Hello everyone, good afternoon and welcome to our live stream. If you can hear me all right, just go ahead and type in the chat box, say hello. Hi Colin. I know everyone had a very busy few weeks with this color layer, so I appreciate you guys turning in your work and attending our session here. While we wait for a few more people to kind of log in. Hi Penny. Do you guys have any overall questions you want me to address? I know there was, for those of you who maybe watched this morning, some of this might be a repeat, but I talked to everyone this morning about kind of our plan moving forward in the class for our critiques, because I know a lot of you still feel like you need a little more time and you didn't get around to painting in the features just yet, and just so you know, that's perfectly fine. I want everyone to take as much time as needed for this first color pass, because it's really important to maintain your drawing and try to get your color pass as good as you can in the first layer, because it makes your process moving further along much easier. You won't have as many corrections to make. And so what I'm thinking is, I was planning on skipping, kind of giving you guys more time before we do a critique next week, but so I think what we're going to do is do a mini critique next week, because I was going to give you guys another 2 weeks to kind of get through the next section. But what the critique next week will be is just for those of you who haven't painted in the features yet, and didn't get around to that yet. So we're going to hold a little mini critique session so I can take one more look at your paintings before you move on to applying the second color pass. Just because the features are really important and I want you guys to take as much time as needed to catch up. So don't feel like you have to rush through. Kind of moving forward in the class as far as the lessons go, each layer is going to be more nuanced and kind of slow. There won't be many major changes, and the workload is going to be less and less over time. So if you feel like you need to push and have a little more time with this first layer, that's okay, because you'll be able to kind of catch up as we move forward in the with the lessons. Today you'll find in the in your student portal the new lesson for the week, but don't feel like you have to do that second color pass this week. Just concentrate on getting this first color pass finished and to where you're happy with it for our short critique next week. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into the critique sessions. We're going to start with Randy. I thought I saw you in here earlier. Okay, so Randy, I just wanted to start with a couple of, I wanted to, if you're in here, just say hi in the chat box. But I wanted to see if this photo is a good representation of how your painting looks. I can tell some areas are kind of sunk in, like some of these shadows here. So when that's the case, I just ask because I want to make sure if your photograph turned out a little warmer, and this goes for everyone, or if your photograph turned out a little cooler, I want to make sure I'm not giving you color advice on a photo that doesn't quite represent how your painting looks in person. I'm also going to be putting up a bonus video this week on how to photograph your paintings the best for critique, because everyone seems to be struggling with that a little bit, and I understand it's really, really kind of tricky to get it to represent how your painting feels in person. But the closer we can get that, the easier and better feedback I can give you here during our critique sessions. I don't know if you're in here, Randy, but if you are, just say hello and let me know how this looks. My feeling looking at the photograph of your painting is that the shadows and stuff aren't quite dark enough. And that's probably because the color is sinking in a little bit. But I'm going to play around with bringing this a little bit darker so it feels a little closer to probably what the painting is in real life. The only other thing I can't quite sense is if this is warm light on your painting, like if you photographed it under a warm light, or if your colors are on a little bit on the warm side. But what I'm going to do is just take out a little bit of the yellow in the midtones here, just a touch. That feels a little more balanced. So I'm going to go based on this, but overall, my first impression is that you have a really nice likeness, and I think moving forward, it will be a matter of refining some of the details and refining some of the forms, and pulling maybe a little bit more of a cool tone into the lights. Oh, there you are, Randy. So how does this look compared to, and Brenda, let me check and see. I think, when did you send that? Let me check. Hold on, guys. I'm just going to check really quick on my phone and see if Brenda's. Brenda, the last image I received from you was for the week 3 color study. So did you send it to the contact@leeartstudio.com? Or maybe you're sending it with a different email address? If you try sending it to me again right now, I can pull it in and do your critique. No, I know, Randy, this is your painting, but Brenda had messaged me and said that she sent it in, but I didn't receive it by email. I'm just trying to make sure I have it. Okay. Brenda, do you mind? Okay, double check and try and send it again to the contact@leeartstudio.com and let me know when you have in the chat box, and I'll check for it. Okay, so Randy, back to your painting. So I wanted to ask you if the colors in the skin tones are very similar in this photo, because I kind of modified it a little bit, to how they feel in person. Because sometimes a camera will tend to favor, yellow, or it'll favor, warm or cool, and it's about trying to find that correct white balance when you're shooting your painting. So before I start going into talking about color on your painting, I want to try and get it as close as it feels to you when you're looking at your painting in real life. So just let me know there in the chat box before I start going into critiquing. And as I mentioned just a minute ago, I'll be uploading a little quick tutorial on how I go about photographing my work and the type of light I use, since everyone seems to be struggling, and also go into how to kind of photograph under different situations if you're having trouble or you don't have a nice lighting setup to photo under. Then I'll talk about some alternative methods you can use for shooting outdoors. So I'll post that up probably middle of the week before our next critique. So hopefully that will help you guys get some better pictures to work with. Okay, so Randy, you said the background is more lavender, the skin was yellow. Okay. So let me play with the color balance again. The most challenging part of working long distance is I can't be there with you and look at your painting in person. So I want to make sure that I have as close to a representation as possible. How does that look in the skin tones? Is it looking a little better? I just want to make sure it looks pretty close. Kind of ignore the background for now. I'm mostly going to concentrate on the skin tones. Does that look pretty close? Okay, perfect. All right, so I know there's also variation with computer screens and all of that, so we just kind of have to compromise and try and work around that a little bit. So you have a really nice strong likeness here, and I think really moving forward it will be about building more nuanced transitions and maybe adding more concentration of detail and contrast in the features, like the eyes, for example. But before we go into the features, as you can see in our lesson this week, we actually go in and refine some of the light planes of the larger planes of the face. And one area that's kind of jumping out to me is this area here. Let me grab a wider pen here. So this little section on the cheek feels very, very warm even compared to some of these other zones of the face. And it's okay to have that nice warm undertone. I actually ended up adding more warmth to some of those areas in my areas. So for example, and it also could be like a little lighter. So if you start to go in and apply a little bit of those lighter cool pinks, maybe something more alizarin crimson based, and then also concentrate, like if you look into these areas here, you get these kind of lavender cool blues and grays that are usually where the skin gets a little thinner near the eye. So if you can look for those areas where you can enhance some of those effects, it can help to kind of complement what's going on in the rest of the skin, and it'll balance out some of those really warm areas. The same goes for the cool pink in her cheeks here. It's actually quite kind of rosy as opposed to peach. And so maybe to balance out that, you can add maybe a little, let's find a different color. It'll have to be maybe a little bit more saturated just for to balance out your painting. But maybe a little bit of alizarin, cadmium, and white can give you a nice rosy pink for that area of the cheek there. Almost the color you have here in the lips, but just lighter. That's a nice color. Looking here, like in the bridge, there is that pink in this area here, but you can see how it also turns into kind of that cool gray. So I think what will help balance out your painting is looking for the lavenders, looking for the grays, and it will start to balance out that warm peachy hue that you kind of have as the dominant color. And it just looks like she is under a warm light as opposed to a cool light. So just starting to introduce some of those cool tones is going to help a lot. Another area to look for those tones is in here in the forehead. You can see that that is quite cool. So in these transitions here, just introducing a cool tone before it turns into a warm shadow again. And there's some pink there too. And you'll see in my demonstration for my painting that I actually go in and accent with pink, and I actually build a little bit more of that blue-gray through this part of the forehead. And it's not, yours isn't going to be exactly the same just because you're working from a different angled reference. But to look for those areas where you can balance out some of those tones. A great area to look is right here. As this plane change turns down, you can really see how this area, for example, takes on this kind of taupe gray, and then it transitions into that pink rosy tone up towards the top. And it kind of turns into that cool kind of gray as it rolls down, and it gets even darker and picks up even some of that gray lavender from the background as it moves down. So work on implementing some of those colors, like this one down here. Instead of it warming down here, start to cool it off as it blends up into that cheek. Maybe even making it a little lighter towards the top so that your values are working. And it stands out right now, but if you start to implement it throughout the portrait in different areas, then it can help. So you did try putting a gray-green there. The green aspect might have made it a little bit too strong, or maybe made it not feel right. So if you plan on keeping this more of this blue lavender, then that is definitely going to reflect into those skin tones as those forms roll away. And you'd be surprised at how much you can kind of push that without it feeling garish or anything like that. So yeah, and then just keeping, you know, your values in check as it moves down. It does transition into a slightly lighter version, but I think it's still cool through like this section of the chin, and it warms up. So it stays kind of cool. Oops. Sorry, I need to make a smaller pin there through this section, but then it warms up into the pink zone again here. So I think if you implemented that, you have some of that warmth there, but maybe this value is too light, especially because of the way this is transitioning, and that's that fall off of light that we get. So maybe implementing a little bit of that green gray, sorry, not green gray, a little bit more of a blue gray towards that bottom. It's a pretty neutral color. It's really not excessively strong in one direction or another, but I would say if it had to favor one color over another, it would be that it favors maybe a blue-gray, similar to your background color. The upper muzzle area is a little bit lighter, and you'll notice that it takes on a cool tone as well because we have a little bit of peach fuzz there. And so you might go just a little lighter and cooler there. You could even implement a little bit of pink. I tend to think of it as kind of a somewhat neutral zone. So you can implement some of your forehead colors in there, and I would work on brightening up that left side. Your value on the right side of the muzzle seems pretty good. And then when you go back into the nose, you have a nice strong red there, but up in here, again, just balancing out some of that pink, which it is in there, but it's kind of more broken. It's kind of like broken color. So you have a kind of a cooler tone intermixing with like a warmer tone. And then with the nose shape, I would just suggest, it feels like it's kind of scooping a lot here. So I would just say work on straightening that out and maybe lightening that up a little bit, but maybe just through this bridge here, just kind of straighten that line out a little bit, and it'll look a little more like her. Do you have any other questions? And you're not going to go into the features yet for that second pass, so just concentrate on the large planes. When you do go into the features though, look at the contrast there in the mouth, especially on this right side. Now this could be sunk in, I can't quite tell, but make sure that you're not afraid to put in those nice rich deep reds, and maybe the same kind of deep red in the nostril here. Not that you want it to stand out that much. It looks like that area is kind of sunk in. So, but just make sure that you're using those warmer colors in the kind of holes and crevices of the face. It'll give it more life to those colors. So do you have any questions? I think you have a really solid start. So are your eyes too big? You know, they actually feel pretty close. I think what would help is eventually when you do go in and do the second pass on the eyes, is to kind of define a little bit more clearly where the borders of the eyes are, where the eyelash line is, for example. I can see it a little bit more on this eye, but on this one it gets a little murky and hard to see. And I think if once you're able to go in and kind of add some definition in there with some of the dark accents, I think you'll find that they balance out quite well. But don't worry about that just yet. Just concentrate on those larger planes, and then I'm going to have a video coming a little bit later, kind of midweek, and and that's going to be your week 7 lesson. And that's where we refine a little bit in the features. But we're not going to have a critique on that next week, so just take your time with the layers. And I'm going to email everyone some of the changes to our critique schedule. I'm just trying to give everyone enough time to make sure you spend ample time in this first color pass. So I'll send out a new schedule. It's not going to be that drastically different. We're just actually adding like a mini critique in between our sessions. So I'll send everyone an email about that. But everything else looks really good. Any other questions? Not glaze especially, but you'll see when you watch today's lesson that was released this morning, the second color pass where I only pretty much go over the major planes like the forehead. I do go over the nose, I go over the cheek, I kind of skip around the mouth and the eyes, but I do pretty much all of this area. And I talk about adjusting temperature, adjusting hue through glazes and scumbles. It's not just about glazing, but it's about kind of making adjustments and smoothing out like transitions that maybe need a little bit more detail, or even finding smaller shapes within the smaller forms and adding more detail that way. So just watch that video before you move forward and make some of these adjustments. Okay? Yeah, really nice work though. And if you have any follow-up questions, just reach out to me on the forum. Oh, you're very, very welcome. Nice work. And if you wanted to, just a note on the background, Randy, if you wanted to change the background, I will have a video later on how to adjust the background. I'm going to be turning mine into a kind of a setting, or kind of like an ambiguous setting. So I think that's what I'm going to do. So I'll talk about how to implement those changes. Or if you decide you want to go add a little more lavender to the background, you can do it now, but it's not a real big priority. Okay, Brenda, let me pull yours in here. Oh, okay. I see what happened. Yeah. Okay. So you had labeled it week 3 and it got confused with it. Okay, that's no problem. Let me just share the image here and get it up into the program. Okay. All right, here we go. Pull up the photo reference here, and I'm just going to pull up your color study as well, since I still have it in here. So have you guys found the color studies to be helpful? All right, so let me just get this a little larger. All right, so now we're all set, Brenda. Thank you for letting me know. Sorry about that. So, okay, so it looks like, have you had a chance to start painting in any of the skin tones? Or, no, that's okay, Brenda. We'll go ahead and go over yours now. So, have you had a chance, because to me this still looks a little bit like the underpainting. Oh, your painting isn't this warm? Okay, let me adjust a couple of things first. Could be the saturation is a little high. Let me pull this up. Let's first do a little color balance. So you haven't put any skin tones on. Okay, that's helpful because I just wanted to make sure. But the background is not that warm. Is that what you were saying? So maybe it's a little bit more. Balanced like that. Does that look a little better? Okay, all right. So yeah, let's talk about that then. Let me just bring some of the dark values. It's a little hard to tell with the some of the window glare or the light glare on the left side here, but I'll try to address your concerns here. Okay, so just as a note for, I know this photo might still be a little bit red, but just make sure that when you do go into your background here, try to pull it away from the red before you start your skin tones, because that's going to influence your skin tones drastically, especially because she's so pale and her reds are very nuanced. I would aim more towards like a blue-gray, maybe something like that for the background, kind of a soft lavender. That's going to make a big difference, and it can be a darker version of that color. But you can see how that is going to make a difference. So let me do this, make sure I'm doing this on another layer here. So if we just imagine getting rid of some of that red, because even the red from the underpainting can start to throw your skin tones. And I mentioned this earlier to everyone who was concerned. They had some of their underpainting showing like this area here where it's really, really orange. You don't want to judge your skin tones too early. You want to make sure you've blocked everything in. I'm just erasing here. You want to make sure you've kind of blocked everything in one color layer before you go back and start, nuancing and tweaking and, getting really picky with your painting. So that's something to just keep in mind as you work, is that these colors from the underpainting can throw your perception of your color a little bit. So it's best to kind of trust your palette, trust your mixtures from your color study, and just go through with the first color block in, even if things feel a little off. And you probably noticed even with mine, before I had put in any of her lips or eyes, or even the reds in the nose, she felt very pale. But as soon as I introduced those areas where the color was more concentrated, it really brought her other skin tones to life. So remember that, just keep that in mind as you're working through your painting. But the background, if you definitely knock out some of that red, that's going to make a big difference here. And what I recommend, as far as, like you were saying, how do you handle the edges between the hair and the background? It kind of requires that you paint both while they're still wet. So that way the hair doesn't feel pasted onto the background, or the background doesn't feel like it's cutting into the hair. So as you go in and repaint your background, I would suggest that same day that you retouch at least the outside edges of the hair. So taking in that nice dark brown and going in and just even if it's just a glaze, just go in and re-wet that edge, and then make sure you take a soft brush and blend those edges between the hair. in the background. Don't worry about little wisps of hair. We will add those later. But as far as some of your, like you could even paint, block in some of those other colors for the hair as you move around. But just make sure that you always have some color that's wet when you paint in your background, and that's going to help you blend those edges together. And you can change the hair shape or whatever as you're doing that too if you want to. But you can see how having a softer edge around the hair can help. Yeah. So Brenda, when you're working in using a like natural daylight, like a window or something. One thing that can help with glare is experiment with your angle to the window. If your lighting is coming from the left, just try to angle yourself kind of somewhat 45 degrees to that window, and it will help. And also, if the light is coming in too strong, like if you have, south-facing windows, or if you get direct sunlight, try hanging up like a semi-sheer white cloth over the window, even just temporarily while you're working, and it will help soften and cool that light as it comes in, and especially if there's any direct sunlight, and it'll help balance it out and cut down some of the glare that you might be fighting while you're painting. Okay, and if you're painting, like if you blocked it in and it felt too thick, like I could see some of that texture here in the hair, like right in here. You can always, while that layer is dry, before you go back in and repaint these edges, you can take a palette knife, okay, and hold it flat against the surface of your painting. So like if you take your palette knife like this, it's a really bad drawing of a palette knife, but if you hold it flat against the surface of the panel and then you scrape up and down, or even in the direction that the ridges go, you will be able to peel off some of those really thick areas, and it'll scuff the painting just a little bit in those areas, so use a smaller knife if you need to, but then you can go back in and repaint it and nobody will know, and it'll get rid of those ridges. I do that sometimes if I have a big fleck of dust in like a weird spot, if it's like in the eye, and it's really bothering me, before I go in and repaint that area, I will scrape off that dust or that paint ridge before I go back in and repaint. So they tend to show up a lot more if you're working on a smooth surface like panel. So hopefully that'll help, and it'll also help because when you go in and you want to bring these two edges together and have them blend, you might have like a ridge from the old layer. I would take that palette knife and just scrape along that edge before you go back in and paint and remove any ridges. You could also take a very, very fine grit wet dry sandpaper, and or even some artists use Cuttlebone, and you can scrape just a little bit along that edge to remove some of the texture before you go back in and paint. So you were working with a color bounce light on a stand. Okay, you could, how high up is it? So if you ever have a light source and it's coming in from the side, like over here, you're gonna get glare. That's just how it is. I have mine coming down from a top angle 45 degrees. So the higher you can get that light, the better. And if it's still creating a lot of glare for you, what you might try doing is taking that light and bouncing it on the ceiling. So if you have it like in a fixture, point that fixture to where the light bounces up on the ceiling, and then you'll get this ambient light coming down. It won't be as bright, but it'll be a little bit more soft and ambient. Another thing you can try doing is if it's not going to be a hot light, like anything that gets too warm, if it's like a fluorescents even take on a little bit of warmth, but if it's like an LED light or something that's going to stay cool to the touch, you can take a sheer piece of fabric and drape it in front of the light, or I sometimes use tracing paper or that vellum that we use for our drawing, and I'll drape it in front of my light source because I have like a little LED light that comes down like this, and it has little flaps on it for focusing the light, and I just tape. I still make sure that my light doesn't come in contact with the paper, but I kind of drape my paper over like this. I tape it here, and it helps to diffuse the light. So you can try a couple of those things and see if it helps you with the glare. But getting it up above your easel as much as possible to where it's, you know, the light is kind of angled down in that direction, it can help. Yeah, and sometimes it could just be that your bulb is just really, really bright. And I find that the diffuser really, really helps, just in general. So try bouncing it up towards the ceiling. If that's too dark, you could either buy another light and have two lights bouncing on the ceiling, one on each side, kind of like this. And then you'll get that nice ambient light coming down. Or you can do what I said with the drape and just see if that helps. Okay? And so for next week, did on this first pass, I want you to concentrate on just getting the large planes, and if you can, the features, but don't rush it. If you need to just get the large planes blocked in for next weekend, then do that, and then slowly get to work. Just get as far as you can with the features, or with the major planes of the face in color, and then do the features. And then because all the other layers that we're going to be doing moving forward are kind of, it's less work. It's not as work intensive. It's just going to be kind of tweaking this and that, and adding little details and that sort of thing. So this is really the most important stage of this process. So make sure you spend as much time as needed on it. Do you have any questions, Brenda? When I do the video on how to photograph your work, I will show everyone what my light looks like and kind of its approximate angle to my easel. My light is mounted on my ceiling above my easel, so I don't tend to move it around. And I have 9-foot ceilings, and it comes down about a foot, so it's about 8 foot above my easel. So it sounds like you're really close to having it at the right height. Your light source. So it could just be a matter of finding the right angle or maybe diffusing the light a little bit. All right, very good. Good job. And thank you for sending that to me. I'm sorry I missed it in the email. All right, Tammy, are you in here? Now I know you had a couple of questions, Tammy, and you had mentioned something about feeling like her skin tones were too pale looking. And I wanted to mention this to kind of everyone too. Oh, there you are. Hi. Don't judge your skin tones until you get the features blocked in, because they totally, completely change the way the face feels. Those higher concentrations of chroma that exist in the lips and then the eyes and the nose make a huge difference on the feeling. I felt like my painting felt too pasty as well during that first pass, but as soon as I started introducing the features, I could see where it needed to be balanced, and it wasn't as far off as I had felt in the beginning. So you're saying it seems too dark. Do you mean like the background or her skin tones seem too dark? I could try bringing up the brightness a little bit. Something like that, maybe. Does that feel a little closer to what it looks like? Okay, that's better. I'll start to take into account the comparison between like the flesh tone value and her lightest shirt value, which is something like that. And then she has like this average flesh tone of like this. And if we just compare, your average flesh tone is that, and then your lightest value on the shirt is this. So I think you could be a little bit dark. Maybe too much light. I can bring that down just a little bit. Okay. All right, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about. So my first suggestion, Tammy, would be to go in and finish out the features before you worry about a second pass on the portrait. When you go into those features, it's going to build a lot more color into the portrait. I do feel like your background has a little too much red to it, and that's going to bleach out the warmth in the skin tones where they do exist, that kind of red tone in the skin. So I would suggest going through and taking a little bit more of a lavender gray and just scumbling over this red. And it can be a dark version of that color too. You know, it doesn't have to be real light, but it just needs to be a little bit more neutral and more towards a blue gray rather than a red. And if you just made kind of this kind of neutral lavender color and scumbled it over the red zones, it's going to help balance out some of those skin tones as well. I'm just doing this kind of loosely, but it's going to help enhance those reds in the skin. The only other thing I'm kind of sensing is that you can kind of pump up the saturation on the skin tones in a few areas, mostly in some of these transition tones here. And it could be that the photo is kind of bleaching those out. So let me know if you feel like that's the case. But I think if you just livened up some of these tones and make sure you get down into this darker range of halftone, you know, on these planes that are starting to turn away, like right in here, and moving towards that shadow, getting even darker. It's going to give more impact to the light areas of the portrait. As I mentioned before, block in the features first and then go through and you'll make these changes later. I think you have a nice red in here, but moving out of that, it shouldn't be as light as what you have over here. So right now, the left side of the face and the right side of the face highlights feel about the same. And if you take an example of over here, and then you take an example of over here, kind of those average lights, there should be that overall hierarchy. You're struggling to get a good photo of it. Yeah, I'm going to have that tutorial, and hopefully that will help you get a better photograph for me to critique. I think I'm really sure that as soon as you go in and introduce some of these warms, like the pink and the lips, I'm just going to do a simple color here. It won't be as nuanced as what you'll be putting in, but you can see when you pump up the saturation in some of these areas, it makes a big difference in the whole feeling of the portrait, especially the lips for some reason, because when we see lips that are really pale, it kind of makes the person not look alive. So really beefing up some of those colors and looking for those points of real saturated planes can really, really bring the portrait to life. Same thing when you go into the nose here, going in with more of a kind of a pinky peach tone and pumping up the saturation there, pumping in some of the saturation in the cheeks a little bit more. Those kind of things are going to help the portrait start to pop a little bit more. Some of these transitions here, moving across the form in this direction. Sorry, that's a really big. So moving across this direction here, it feels very sudden with the way it hits that shadow. So you want to make sure when you go in with your color that you're building in these darker halftones. So make sure that you've included, enough of that transition to that shadow edge. And your shadow might be getting a little skinny there, so make sure you have the correct width. And sometimes these drawing changes, we don't see them until we're well into the color stage. You struggle with color being too light? Yeah. So you're saying you struggle with color being too light, and when you make it more pink red, it seems too garish, and you're trying to learn how to mix color better. Yeah, and a lot of color is about value control. And it's very easy for us as soon as we start thinking about color to kind of forget about values. It's one of the first things because we're trying to determine saturation or color intensity compared with values. And let me give a quick demonstration of that, because I think it will help illustrate the idea of what I mean here. So let me take off these here. So if we, for example, let's take a very saturated color. Let's go with red, right? By all means, that seems like a bright red, right? And we would consider that color really, really bright. However, maybe it'll be easier to see if the background color wasn't the same value. Here, we'll do it on a slightly lighter background. So that red is really, really bright. So what we'd consider bright. But what we're trying to describe when we say, oh, it's a bright red, we're trying to describe the color intensity, the chroma. And so we go, oh, that's a bright red. But what we're forgetting to think about is what value. Take that same color and we take away the saturation, the chroma. Look at how dark that value is. It's actually probably around a value, let's look at our value scale here. It's probably around that one or this one. It definitely falls into the darker range. But when we see that, but when we see it in color, we think, oh, that's a really bright red. And that's often what happens when we're trying to find colors like here. We think, oh, that's a really, really intense red. And so we tend to make it what we consider bright. So we probably make it a little more saturated and we try to make it a little bit lighter, right? But what's happening is it's actually the intensity of the color of the chroma that's tricking our eyes. And if we took that same color, took away the saturation, you can see that it's a darker value on a scale of, black to white. So let's take a different color other than red. Let's take a yellow. And we'll go like mid-saturation yellow. Okay, that's clearly a brighter color. It's brighter than the red. But what value is it? And this is something that it's hard to see at the beginning. So if it's not always the easiest concept to grasp, but it's one of the important ones when you're starting to learn color and you're trying to control your color mixtures. So let's take a look at that yellow when we take away the saturation. Red. But that yellow is actually much lighter value than the red. Does that make sense? So I really like this illustration of the idea just because very rarely do we work with colors that saturated. But oftentimes when we're talking about skin tones, everything's a muted value, but it doesn't mean you don't have areas of higher saturation. And naturally, as you go lighter in value, you lose saturation. Okay, so if you take, for example, this color here, and we take this color here, and let's take even maybe a brighter pink here from the lips. So we just took some of the more saturated colors, and let's just take a look at what their values are. So you can see even in the lip color, which was this was the lip color here. So that was from right in here. You can see it's a darker value. And then this color was from the cheek, and then this was from over here. Yeah, so when you're dealing with portrait skin tones and you feel like they look pasty white, it's partly because when you're putting in those saturated colors, you might be doing it at too light of a value, and then it starts to look garish. You could also be maybe not mixing the color gray enough, or taking out some of the saturation while also getting darker. And you take out saturation of a color by adding its complement. So this is kind of a red kind of tone, and so if you add a little bit of kind of a blue-green to it, you're going to kind of neutralize that. Or you can take like we used, I think, a alizarin crimson, and I added a little bit of blue and white to it, and that helped to gray it out a little bit. So just keep that in mind as you work through your portrait. The areas that you're about to paint are some of the more saturated areas. So the lips, the nose, and the eyes. We have this higher concentration of, and they're not everywhere, but there's certain areas where you want to look for those pops of color. Like there's that pop of pink under the eye here. There's definitely a rich saturated red-orange in this section here. You have it in here as well. You definitely have it under here. And overall, the lids have a little more pink quality. The nose, if you look in here, we have that really red-orange here. So that color, and we have it in the lips as well. But we have that kind of rich, even though it's dark, it's very saturated. So think of saturation or chroma as color intensity or richness. And it kind of naturally goes down when you add white, because the white is kind of diluting that color. But you can still have more saturated areas. They're just going to be different values, even just comparing these two zones here and looking in. And you actually have an okay value change here, but I think your color maybe could be a little bit more pure and pink in here. And the garishness that you're talking about, sometimes it's just color relativity. So just because you put in a little bit more of a saturated color in one spot, it's gonna, of course, it's gonna stand out if that's the only area where you put a more saturated color. But as soon as you start introducing, you know, more variety to the color everywhere else, and you have those saturated colors in the red zones, it's going to help balance out that area, and it won't feel so garish. Okay, so remember to keep, I mean, even if we looked at her picture in black and white, you can see that the value range, almost everything is in like a middle to lower gray scale except for the highlight areas. So it could be that maybe overall your painting got a little too light in value. So just work on bringing those midtones down. You're going to concentrate on these areas, you know, especially this side. It should not have anything you know, the average tone, if you compare this side to this side, they shouldn't be anywhere really related. Even the highlights in this zone do not compete with the highlights in this zone on this side of the face, or even the highlights in the forehead. That fall off of light kind of goes this way, but it also goes diagonal. Does that make sense? So when you go in to your second color pass, work on making these sections darker at first. You know, but of course I meant to, that's after you block in your features, because that's going to help a lot as it is. I hope that made sense, and I hope that you find that helpful. Do you have any other questions, Tammy? Also, Tammy, I know she feels like she's glowing in this picture, but one of the ways we get the illusion of glow in the skin tone is by controlling those dark values and controlling the values around the model too. So just keep that in mind. It's very tempting to take these light values and spread them out to make them feel brighter, but actually the more you kind of push in your midtones, the brighter impact these are going to kind of have overall. Okay, good. I'm glad you found that helpful. All right, so yeah, as you progress, concentrate on getting the features done for next week's critique and submit. If you can't adjust these bigger planes, don't worry about it, because that'll be the following week's critique for our group, since you haven't quite finished the features. So just concentrate on getting the eyes, nose, and mouth painted in for next weekend, okay? All right, nice work. Oh, in that background too. Adjust that background, because that's going to make a big difference in your perception of those skin tones. All right, good work. All right, Penny. Are you in here, Penny? I just wanted to check with you on the color and value balance of your painting, just to make sure I'm in the right zone. It does look to me like some of these areas are sunk in, like the hair here. So I'm not going to worry about that too much. There you are. Hello, Penny. Okay, so yeah, you have a really nice start here. I think, just let me know, does that look pretty close to how your painting feels in person? Is it too red, or does it feel about right? Not compared to this photo. I'm talking about just how the painting feels to you when it's on your easel. It's pretty close. Okay, great. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So it looks like the same thing for you. You haven't quite painted in the eyes, nose, and mouth, and that's perfectly fine. So this week I want you to concentrate on that, but I'll still give you some feedback on the larger planes. That way, if you have time, you can start working on that. I think you have an overall really good capture of her skin tones. I think there's some areas where we can kind of push and pull some of the cool and warm. And I think once you get the features painted in, it's going to feel more colorful overall. Especially like the lips have a big impact on, you know, giving life to the painting. You have a nice fall off of light across the form here, and even going down the form this direction. The only thing I would say is to maybe push some of the cool zones on the face a little bit more. It looks like they're going kind of greenish in the portrait here, and I would suggest going maybe a little bit cooler in this lower zone. You can almost see on the portrait right here, just below the cheek area here, you can see how this section down here really takes on kind of a cool gray. And yours is maybe a little bit more of a yellow tone. So hers is more of a lavender gray. Yours is just a little bit too yellow. So what I would do is start to take that down a little bit in that, take down some of that yellow. I did it in my portrait. You'll see when I added my second pass, I actually went through and cooled off that area as well. It was a lot easier for me to see that once I had painted in my features. So that's one of the early things I did. Now it does take on a little bit more of that greenish gray right next to the shadow. And I think you have a pretty good sense of that here, and especially on that left side. But you will notice, like over in this zone on the face, next to the eye, it takes on a very cool kind of lavender tone, and you have maybe got a little dark in that area. And don't be afraid to carry some of this deeper shadow color over and around that eye, just a little bit. And even as this part of the cheekbone right in here pushes back, it should slowly start to get just a little bit darker. That way it doesn't, and cooler. That way it doesn't jump forward as sharply. So just kind of knocking that back a touch. So yeah, so what I'm talking about a lot of times in those midtones, I feel like you captured certain areas really well, but I think what I'm doing here at the lower jaw and on that far side, yeah, maybe a little bit more of like a blue violet rather than a blue green for those halftones. Like you have more of a yellow influence, and I would go more, maybe just a little bit cooler. She has a little bit of that green on this far side right next to the shadow, but I think before then it's just a little bit, it has a little bit more of a cool kind of violet tint. It's almost picking up some of this background color that you have. And this is a different angle, so we're getting a little more of that lavender influence rather than the green influence in her skin. Also with the shadow here, just with the shape, I would start to bring this up just a touch. And don't forget to have a nice soft edge where that form rolls down. Just to give you a quick sense of what the painting will look like once you get some of these reds in, is once you introduce that nice rich pink, I'm just doing a simple color here. She has obviously more nuance to that, to these shapes here. But once you get some of these really rich saturated reds into the lips there, you're going to see a big difference in how the other skin tones that are maybe reading a little warm to you, how they feel. Just make sure when you paint in her lips, see how cool of a pink it is. It's almost like a cotton candy pink. It's not real red-orange. So just remember to keep that a little bit cooler, and that might help to balance out some of those warm tones in the skin. She has really warm zones like right in here. They take on a little bit more of that peachy color, and I think you got that color really, really close. But maybe closer to the highlights, instead of going more of a yellow peach tone, go a cooler pink. Just in a few areas like that, and that's going to help knock it into her skin tone range a little bit more. Does that make sense? Yeah, that lip color, I'm telling you guys, it makes a huge difference. I noticed it with mine too. So, you know, I was feeling like she looked a little pasty. But I remember from just, painting over and over again that you don't really want to judge your colors too much and make major changes until you've got everything blocked in with at least one color layer. Then you can start to tweak things this direction or that direction. If you go down into this chin, for example, maybe using a cooler pink for the highlight instead of going a little warmer. She does have that kind of peachy tone in the chin here. And then, of course, there's those reds and pinks in the nose that are going to help, and that deep, rich red. And you see a lot of it in this angle. You have this really kind of deep rose color, even in the shadow, like in here. And you have like this really deep crimson red in the nostril. So just taking those out of that brown zone and going more warm with it, it's going to add a lot of color to the whole portrait as well. Yeah, so yes, a little bit more alizarin in the, you can still use a little bit of cadmium, but for like a lot of the lip colors, I used a mixture of alizarin, a touch of cadmium, and a little bit of white. And then of course I made my value scale out of that. And then for those darkest reds, like the crease and the nostril here, try using alizarin crimson with transparent red oxide if you have that, or like an iron oxide or an orange oxide if you have something of the variation. You could even try burnt sienna, but it does tend to be a little bit lighter and more opaque. Even a touch of cadmium can sometimes work in those areas, but you really want that rich, dark for some of those areas like the nostrils and the crease in the mouth and that sort of thing. But it's definitely more of a berry pink rather than, because cadmium red is actually like a red orange, and alizarin crimson is a red violet. So that's going to make a big difference in the feeling of warm versus cool. All right, so do you have any other questions? I think you have a really nice start. Another area that's going to help is you have kind of this warm yellow color, but she's very kind of lavender in this neck. It's almost not even what we would consider a skin tone. And if you compare the neck colors to her flesh tones up in here, you can see that she does have a few more of those peach tones. She tends to get it right in here, and I added it in my portrait, a little bit more of that peachy pink color in that section on the bridge of the nose. You can take this color, and it's a little bit more yellow compared to this color, which has maybe a little more pinkish tint to it, or even compared to something closer to the highlight color. And then you go down into the neck, and it's like these almost non-skin tone colors. They're very lavender gray. So gray that down a little bit and don't overemphasize the light there. Okay? Any other questions? I'll make a little note for you there on that those are the neck colors here. And then, yeah, so that was it. Okay, so do you have any other questions? All right, good job. Yeah. So just keep practicing that color mixing. You might even look at maybe this color again, and for the shirt, and make it a little bit more blue. Just take that same color and just add more ultramarine blue to it, and you'll probably land right on the color. Okay? And if you have questions, you can always send me a picture or post a picture in our forum of your palette and your painting, and or any color changes that you're kind of playing with. And I'll give you some feedback on mixtures if you're struggling with them. All right. Yeah, good work. So just concentrate on the features for now, though. If you can't get around to repainting the skin tones for that second pass, just concentrate on the eyes, nose, lips for next weekend. Okay? Very nice. Good job. All right, Alexandra, are you in here? All right. Well, you have a really, really nice start to your portrait, a nice solid block in. It looks like you got most of the features painted except for this right eye here. So for the coming week, concentrate on getting that right eye blocked in. And you could start a second color pass if you have time. I would say the background feels a little sunk in, so I can't quite tell, but I would suggest making it a little bit darker to get her to feel a little lighter. Let me get another layer here going. So maybe something to bring a little bit more drama to her skin tones, even if it's just on one side of the figure, and kind of gradates maybe over a little bit and maybe gradates up. It feels a little maybe red down in the bottom, so maybe try find areas where you can introduce maybe a cooler lavender color, and that's going to help set off some of the skin tones. She does feel overall maybe a little warm, but I can tell that it could possibly be the photo, like the camera. I'm not quite sure. But what I would do is concentrate on your value transitions from this shadow edge. So if you look here, the value that should be right in here is about like that. It's almost the color, just a little bit more red of the background color. So she needs just a little bit more of a soft transition, and there's a darker value that kind of pulls out in this area here. And even here, it's a little bit of a deeper pink kind of pulling out. So I would work on pulling those colors over and getting more of that soft roll towards the shadow. So that way it doesn't seem to hit that value so hard. The same goes down here. Just work on pushing some of those halftones a little bit darker. And it's going to make her feel more light actually in those lightest areas. One of the things that can happen is if you paint your midtones too light, then you end up pushing your light values almost pure white, or you end up going to pure white, and then they have a little less impact. So just concentrate on where you can deepen those values, and maybe cool off a little bit more down in here in this lower jaw. Go more of like a lavender color. Try enhancing some of the coolness of that lower section here. You might be in the right value range, but maybe it needs to go a little darker towards the bottom and just a little cooler. And that's going to help enhance and balance out some of that warmth that the portrait overall had. Same thing goes in this far side. I see that you have a nice cool gray there, but maybe pushing it a little darker, especially right where it hugs the shadow, so you don't have this sudden jump to shadow. Just push your midtones a little bit more. And it might require, like I had to re-wet my shadow edge in order to blend those new midtones along the edge. So if you watch the video where I did my second color pass, I ended up repainting a lot of these edges and working on those transitions a little more subtly, and that made a big difference. So you can see how that is just turning that form more gradually, and also cooling off as it comes down into the lower jaw. Otherwise, you have a really nice start here, and I like that saturated color that you put here in the nostril. Everything else looking pretty good. Make sure you pay attention to how dark her lips truly are in those dark shadows. It's a rich kind of deep berry color. And this side plane on the right side is overall a bit darker than the left side, so that will help emphasize, again, that turning of the form. In the meantime, just finish out this eye before you retouch any of this, and we'll go over this again next week. But really nice work. And if you have any specific questions, since you're not in here live, just send me or make a post in our community forum, and you can post an update there as well if you have any questions. All right, really nice work. All right, Colin. Are you in here, Colin? I included your color study since you didn't get to kind of throw that in last time. And I just wanted it to be able to compare to your painting as it is right now. So I'm just going to kind of stick that over here. It looks like your underpainting is pretty set, but I would say that, hi Colin, I just saw that you're in here. I would say concentrate on just getting that first color pass across all of the planes. You have a really nice sense of the colors here, although I do feel like your color study overall might be too pale in the skin tones everywhere, like especially on this right side of the face. She kind of has, this light is coming down in this direction here, and we have this kind of division where this side is in a different value range than this side. And even if you look, there's kind of this V sense of the light on that left side, and I'm not quite sensing that in this. So I would say work on taking this far side of the face and maybe a little bit down in the jaw and bring it down in value a little bit. And that way, as you move into this portrait, it's a little easier for you to determine some of those colors. So, for example, the value down here should be somewhere along like that value, and then it steps up to a slightly lighter section here, and so on. And then, of course, it picks up a little bit more intensity of the pink, but it's a little bit of a darker value. So I would say work on building up those midtones a little bit further. And you can do that experimentation on your color study first, if you're uncomfortable jumping right into the portrait. And so same thing goes here. I'm going to just do a quick little paint over here. So when you start going into these portraits, make sure like your brightest highlight in here is, except for the nose highlight, which is really close to white, your highlights here in the cheek are kind of a soft pink. So everything, and it's almost the color you have there, everything else though gets darker. So this color below takes on a deeper rosy hue, and then you have like this kind of transition zone. And then it gets more into the cool lavender right in here before it hits that shadow. Maybe just, there's like an in-between color here. And like in here, it's more rosy and doesn't get too light. Now I know I don't think you've gone in with too much color yet in some of these areas, because I can still see your underpainting in this section here on the right. So, but I just wanted to point out that your underpainting could be a little bright in those sections, so just make sure you go for those rich values and keep those values under control when you're painting. My portrait is a little bit lighter than this photo reference from this angle, she's turning away from the light a little bit in this photo, so you're going to have a lot more of that nice mid-tone range. It's a beautiful picture to have, you know, those subtle gradations that you see across the forehead here, you know, starting in that deep gray and then moving over into that softer lavender. But you can see that that value is something more around mid-tone rather than highlight. So yeah, I think you're ready to move into those large planes. So for this week, try to concentrate on blocking in the large planes. Don't even worry about the features if you can't get to them. Don't rush through it. The only other note I wanted to make was on this eye here on the right, on the left side. It feels a little small, and I think it has to do with where this dark line kind of comes down. Let me grab a pencil. So I think what needs to happen is, I see your inner kind of corner here. So this lash line, the dark that you have here, instead just have it kind of come over here and connect, and that's going to help open up the eye and make it feel a little bit larger, and I think that should do it. Everything else feels pretty good. I think it's maybe this is that cast shadow from her eyelashes and it got confused with the other one, so just clarify that area just a little bit. I think the direction of the eye seems okay. This one feels like it's drooping just a tiny bit, but I think if you open up this here and then make sure you don't bring that corner down too far, just kind of maybe bring that up a little higher. It's hard to see in here, but this is actually that corner of her eye, and then that kind of curves down. So just make sure that you keep that corner lifted. And then maybe this droops down a little bit too far. I would make it a little more rounded. Since she's not looking away from us, her eyes are a little more rounded rather than elliptical, the irises. So maybe shorten that one up just a little bit and make sure it's nice and round like this one, and it'll feel like they're heading in the same direction. Does that make sense? And her mouth might be a little droopy on this right side. I would say maybe lift this corner up by about that much, just a small amount. And maybe it needs to extend over just a little bit wider. And that'll help capture her lips a little bit better. I think you're plenty wide on this side. I wouldn't widen that left side, just the right side. One thing that can also help with that droopy feeling in this eye is maybe the tear duct needs to, I'm looking at the reference, when you bring this down, just make sure that you have the tear duct in the right position. I think it's really close. Maybe you just need to clarify the drawing part of it a little bit more. Like I said, I think maybe it was the cast shadow that got confused for this underplane, and then we didn't have this dark line coming over the top. So just clarify that a little bit in your painting. You could even do it in the color stage if that's easier. All right, do you have any questions, Colin? Well, if anything else jumps at you or you want to get feedback in the meantime, just let me know. For next week's kind of short critique, just block out those planes And if you can get to the features, great. If not, don't stress. Just take your time and do as as good of a job as you can for this first pass. The more we rush this first layer, the more we're going to have to go back and correct. So I'd rather you take as much time as you need, because all the other stuff is just finicky, little adjustments. Nope, don't worry about it. It's okay. Life happens, and I've had a crazy few weeks myself, and sometimes it's just hard to get into the studio and paint, and sometimes that happens with classes as well. So I completely understand. Just get it as far as you can. Like I said, I don't want you to rush this first color pass, because it really is a lot of work and it takes quite a bit of time. But if you take your time with it and you do it well, then you're not going to have to make so many tweaks and adjustments in those upper layers. It's really the foundation for the future layers that we'll be painting. So, and I do show, I think in this video this week, I had made a couple of minor adjustments to some of the structure of my shadows and things like that, and I talk about tweaking it. But if my drawing was way off, and I lost my drawing or something when I'd done my initial block in, then it's a lot more for me to try and correct later. So just take your time with it and don't worry about it. Nice work. Your underpainting looks pretty strong. So other than that eye and that mouth, I think you're ready to go ahead and block in those large planes. All right, Stella. Are you in here, Stella? You have a very nice painting started here. I know we had talked a little bit. There you are. So you spent 6 hours reworking your palette. You're much happier now. Oh, thank you, Stella. Yeah, I'm very excited. It's a big competition, and not I wouldn't want to be a judge on that competition. It's not the easiest job, because I know there's some fantastic work that didn't make it into the finalist round, and I'm pretty honored and excited to have 3 of my pieces in the finalist grouping. Yeah, you have a really nice start here. So are you saying that you tweaked your color palette from what you have here? Like what layer you have here, or you tweaked it before you applied it here? I'm just wanting to clarify. Oh, from the color study. Okay, so this image is a little desaturated. Let me see if I can increase the saturation here just a little bit. Is that a little closer? Okay, let me try bringing that background down a little bit. I might lose some of that shadow if I bring it down too much, but maybe I'll bring it down about that much. How does that look? Yeah, so you have a really kind of, it's more pink. Okay, let me try the color balance here. Let's try pushing it more towards red, maybe more towards magenta. Yeah, your model has very pink skin tones, so I can see why. Okay, how's that? Is that a little better? Okay, good, good. Okay, so yeah, you have a really solid start here. I think one of the things, because your model has such cool, she's very, very fair for one, but she has very pink skin tones. She has this really rich kind of peach tone. She has that redheaded complexion here. So like her peach tone and yours is really, really close. I think you're almost spot on. yours might have just a little bit of yellow, but that could be just the photograph. So I think you're pretty good with that. What I would suggest though is to emphasize how pink those feel so she doesn't continue just to feel kind of monochromatic, is to really push the cool tones in your portrait. So, and you get most of those cool grays right in this zone, moving out of the shadow. She has a very warm shadow here. So I think if you go through and you start to work on these transitions here and make them more gray. And she even has, they're kind of a, I would say in some areas they almost feel greenish. In some areas they feel kind of more lavender, I would say. But if you work on kind of softening and deepening some of those darker transitions, it's going to enhance some of the warmth that you're sensing in her skin tone. Another thing I would do is with your background, go for a cooler background, because right now it's so warm that it's kind of not enhancing her skin tones, but rather masking them, because everything kind of has this overall warm hue. And I know that's partly from the underpainting. What you might try doing is taking an ultramarine blue and glazing the whole background with it, and see if that helps. It'll knock it darker, but you can always paint back into it with, you know, some more like opaque colors to bring back some of the glow that you have back here. I like that silhouette effect where her hair meets the background. I think that's going to work nicely for this piece, but I would definitely push the background a little on the cooler side, and that's going to help enhance those, you know, complement those skin tones a little bit more. Looking in, let's see, so some of these other areas kind of have these cool green. They're not real yellow, they're just almost a very neutral gray. But if you look at anywhere where those shadow edges turn, if you can push it a little cooler, it's going to enhance those colors. And then in here she even has more of a, rather than a peachy tone, it's maybe a little bit more of a mauve tone, and it's a little bit darker. She gets a little bit more of that peach tone up here towards the top. But she doesn't quite get as bright through here as she is on the right side. Even looking really close in here where she gets more of these cool lavenders near the eye socket, she gets kind of this cool lavender tone. You can see how much darker they are than the right side of the face. Here she has almost these frosty kind of pinks towards those highlights. So I would work on pushing your values a little darker on the left side of the face a little bit more, and that's going to make her feel brighter on the right side. She has those cool tones down in here as well, kind of connecting that shadow edge, and then she gets that really saturated kind of pink in her chin. And I would say start to push maybe I'm almost wanting to see, no, I think you actually have an okay color there. It could be that perhaps the lights up in here should be a little bit cooler, and that highlight coming down her cheekbone, that plane change could be maybe exaggerated a little bit. She has more of a shadow up here on her forehead too that kind of comes in a little further. And she almost has a little bit of a double shadow. She has like the darker shadow, and then she has something that softens and widens that cast shadow from her nose. So I would maybe widen that over a little bit and leave that slight double shadow. And have a slight softness to it. And that's going to carry up into that bridge as well. So yeah, I think you have that warmth. I would just concentrate on toning back. Like if we even took a blue, and that feels like an ultramarine, and I did it semi-transparent over your background here. You can see how that's already starting to enhance her skin tones a little bit more. And the more you start to cover like down in the chest, if you look down here, you get these really gray greens as those lights, like down in here. It's not even really a strong skin tone. You get kind of this gray, and then you get this really hot, orangey, rich shadow. So it makes for some really interesting colors there. But I think once you knock the rest of that out, it's all going to pull together, and you could probably find areas where you want to maybe pump up the saturation in the lips, like on that shadow side, you know, in those half tones, and that's going to enhance it even further. I think too, like you don't need to go too much into the hair just yet, but you could try finding like a light copper tone and just lightening like the masses of a few areas, just because I think her hair might have gotten just a touch dark in a few areas. Or if you want to leave it, you can, and we'll be painting hair a little bit later. But if you find it kind of fighting your skin tones, then you might try introducing a little bit of that. As far as like freckles go, that's going to be a little bit later, but I can give you a demonstration like towards the end on how to introduce some of those subtle textures in the redheaded complexion. Okay, so the teeth. Yeah. Okay, cooler is better. So it kind of looks like it's just like a highlight on the, well, part of it is in shadow, and then it looks like, let me just pull this reference a little closer so I can see both at the same time. Okay, so one thing that's going to help you differentiate between the teeth is to have that nice dark line. It's not really a line, it's a form, but that underplane here, just to push that a little bit more. And then if you go in with maybe a cooler gray, that's quite warm, but let's see if that stands out. I always build teeth kind of in like a gradual, I work with the darker color and then I move towards the lighter color. Trying to find like an ivory, white gray, something like that maybe. So if you go a little cooler with the teeth, and instead of making a dark line in between the teeth, I would just build up the highlights a little bit. And then the bottom lip, what's going to help that bring that out is bringing that really saturated pink and pushing that warmer. And then she even has a little bit of the darker on the left side, and maybe a little bit as that pushes back into shadow a little bit more there, and that's going to give some of that contrast. And I always say just keep them pushed back a little bit, but try going cooler with the tone at first. And that should help. And she has this little pucker here that's it's kind of lifting. So make sure you look at that shape. And that's going to help push that lower lip forward a little bit more. She gets quite dark in here where this comes down to. So don't be afraid to push the contrast because that's going to help the teeth come forward as well. It's going to probably take a little bit of some small brushes to get in there. But like I said, start working with a darker gray that's a little warmer and then get a little cooler as you get lighter for the teeth, but careful not to make them too bright because then they can kind of stand out too much. And I think her upper lip in this spot could be a little bit, maybe a little bit fuller and a little fuller on this side too. And maybe her shadow for the bottom lip comes up a little sooner. And that'll help kind of lock in her likeness a little wider through here. Okay, did that help a little bit? Teeth are really tricky. Especially luckily you don't have that much, so you don't need to, emphasize it too much, but I would play it down just a touch, even from the photo. Just kind of keep playing with that shape. Oh, you're welcome. We'll talk about getting some of that freckle texture in the skin a little bit later. So right now, kind of ignore that and just paint those main skin tones, okay? Really nice work. Do you have any other questions? And get that nice, when you go into the eyes, start to get some of that nice hazel color in her eyes. I think going a little bit more gray-green and moving it away from this amber color is going to help give a little more life to the portrait as well. All right, nice work. All right, Marianne, are you in here? All right, well, if you're not, I'm going to go ahead and just get started here. My feeling is that the photo is maybe a little light, so I'm going to bring the value down just a little bit. Mostly in those mid-tones. All right, so starting off with just setting up some of your skin tones, since you have everything kind of loosely blocked in, I think if you need, you might want to tone down some of the saturation on that violet background. The color is, it's a little hard to tell because this might be glare in the upper left corner right here, like right in this area. But I think we need to go a little bit more neutral and maybe a little bit more red. So I want you to take maybe some of the color that you have and just add a little bit of burnt sienna to it, just a touch, to kind of, and you can have some of this purple showing through, but you want to kind of neutralize this color just a touch, because the more saturated of a color you have for your background, if it's not quite incorporated into the skin tones, it's going to feel very foreign to her. So if you did have that kind of background, then we're going to see kind of those saturated violets in the skin. So we don't have that, so we're going to kind of push that background a little bit deeper and maybe even a little darker in some areas. So think about maybe a gradient that you might want to incorporate, and that's going to help set her off too, just with the contrast. The second thing is to pay attention to some of the values. So if we take a sample here of, let's say, the average skin tone in her forehead, and we take a sample of the average skin tone in your forehead, you can see that there's a little bit more color and even value difference between the two. So if we took those two color swatches and desaturated them, you can see that it's just slightly darker value on her skin tone than it is in your painting. So I would work on incorporating some of those peach tones, and they're going to feel a little rich in that second pass when you start to incorporate them. But you want to make sure you're pushing the values on the far side darker as well, so that we get that rounding of the form. It looks like we lost a little bit of that shadow shape as well in this darkest area. And you don't have a huge shadow shape, but it's definitely there. And it pushes into the cheek here a little bit. And then you have more of these halftones hugging that shadow edge as well. That's going to create more subtle transitions moving over into the face. If we take that average skin tone in the middle of her cheek here, it's more in this value range. Just kind of loosely indicating those areas, those zones. You have a nice saturated lip color, but it's maybe a little bit hot of a color. So I would take that same color and just add a little bit of white to it, and then maybe in the top lip add a little bit of maybe blue into that red and a little bit of white. And it's going to go, it should still be a somewhat rich color, but not until you get really deep in that shadow. Then it turns into this deep kind of brick red color. But mostly what I'm seeing is that those halftones need to be pushed down a little bit, and you can leave your highlights kind of in the range that they are, but just incorporate maybe a little more color around them. So a little more pink into some of these areas and push that saturation a little bit. And it looks like, I can't tell if you've painted in the nose here, but it looks a little bit like a wash. Maybe start to apply a little bit heavier color application. You want that first color pass to be somewhat thick. You don't want it hanging off the painting, but you want to make sure that you have a nice color layer, and you don't want any of the canvas or your underpainting showing through. So you're not using transparent layers, you're not using glazes at this point. Those come on top of our other color layer. Okay, so look for these planes where we have these cooler transitions, and don't be afraid to push your shadows nice and dark and rich. It's easy to want to stay safe and stay really light, but her shadows are much deeper, so start to work on incorporating some of those richer tones. And as a result, she will feel, I know I changed some of the drawing there, I didn't mean to, but she'll feel a little bit more three-dimensional as a result. Okay, and if you have any questions, just send me a message either by email or post in the forum if you have any questions about my comments here. But nice work, you have a good drawing there underneath, and you do have some of her likeness. Maybe her lips could be a little wider on this left side here. maybe out, oops, it's too thick of a line. Maybe bring that out a little bit wider here. That kind of lines up around there. So just bring that out a little bit further, and that will give you a little bit more elongation in the lips. All right, nice work. And if you have any follow-up questions, just reach out to me. Okay, everyone. Well, that was our critique. So before I let you guys go, I want to talk a little bit about next week. So originally we were going to skip critique next week to give everyone a chance to work on their second color pass. However, since everyone is still kind of, most of you are working on just blocking in the features, if you haven't finished your first color pass and you still need to work on the features, I want you to concentrate on that this week, and we will do a short critique next week where you show me the features blocked in, and I'll give you further feedback. And then the following weekend, we will do our second color pass official critique, okay? If you have managed to paint in everything in one color pass, you can move forward if you want, but we won't critique you next week. We'll critique you the following week. I'm going to send this all in an email. Just keep an eye out for that later, and I'll have a little bit of a remark on how we're going to proceed with our critiques here moving forward. It should steady out. Things got kind of offset because this workload was so heavy these past 2 weeks, and I really couldn't gauge how everyone was going to progress collectively. So everyone's doing really well, but I don't want you to rush this process because this first stage is really important. So don't feel like you have to rush through it. Just get as much as you can done by our next weekend and begin to watch the new lesson, but don't worry about doing that on your painting just yet. You also want to give your underpaint, your first color pass, a decent amount of time to dry. A couple of days at least, just because when you oil out, if your paint is fresh at all, it might lift up some of the color, and I don't want you guys to encounter that. So make sure once you get your color passes all blocked in for that first layer, just give it some time. Give it a couple of days before you go in and start working on that second color layer. So does anyone have any questions? I'm glad it's been really helpful, Stella. Everyone's doing really, really well. So if you guys have follow-up questions, you know how to reach me in the forum. And keep an eye out for the email, and it'll detail kind of what to expect and what to do for next weekend. All right. Thank you, guys. Have a lovely rest of your weekend, and happy Mother's Day to those of you who are moms. And I'll see you next week. All right, guys. See ya.